Evening all. Well, it's finally been done. January the 31st has been, and the United Kingdom is officially out of the European Union. And this was all done in a variety of ways to mark it over a period of a couple of days. First of all, there was the last day speeches given in the European Parliament, first by Nigel Farage and UKIP, who Farage was in classic Farage form, outlining why Britain has decided to leave the EU whilst sounding a warning against the EU's plan to further federalise and squash the identities of all the member states. Then they came out and waved their little flags, and then they got told off by the I can't remember her name, but she was in charge of Parliament that day. She cut his microphone off and demanded that waving flags was against the rules. Also, I wanted to contrast that with Daniel Hannan's final speech. I'm a bit of a fan of Hannan. It's kind of more my style than the visceral Farage. I appreciate Farage for what he brings to the table and his incredible rhetorical skills, but perhaps I feel more resonance with Hannan. But he summed it up put in nicely, covered some of the same points that Farage did, but because he has a greater knowledge of history, I think Hannan summed it up very well indeed. Do check out both men's speeches. But that was it. And then there was one ceremony that I thought was very telling, and that is the one where two people came out into the lobby. I don't know if it was in Brussels or in Strasbourg, but they came out and then they took the Union flag off. They had all the flags were on these small flagpoles in this lobby area, and two officials came out and took down the flag and folded it, and it was all very respectful. They didn't diss Britain in doing this. They didn't let the flag touch the floor. That's very important. And they carried it off. And I thought the visual symbolism of that was very telling, because what you have there is that visual message will go out. You can leave the EU. You can, in a dignified way, have your flag folded up and you leave. You can, that flag coming off the pedestal. I think that was symbolic, and I think that might be an image that will resonate across the European Union, across the member states, when the citizens of the various member states become more and more disillusioned with the European Union. So I thought that was very, very interesting. But then it all culminated in the celebrations in Parliament Square on Friday night. A few of my online colleagues on the live streams were there in person. I found myself in the strange position that people were putting out on Twitter, I'm trying to find such and such, I'm trying to find Poe, I'm trying to find Not So Obvious and Froggy, and I'm sort of tweeting them back saying, they said they're by the Palmerston statue, head towards the Palmerston statue, and things like, Poe's dressed as Britannia, you can't miss her. So I hope it all went well. It looked not like a riot, not like the knuckle-dragging festival that Tom Peck of The Independent wrote about. There weren't hundreds of people, as the BBC claimed. There were a few thousand. I mean, I've heard a figure up to 30,000. Not quite sure if that's accurate, but certainly a few thousand people. A good number, more than the hundreds that the BBC claimed. And it all looked celebratory, but not hectoring. There was, it was celebratory. It reminded me of kind of like a proms night, or if England do well at a sporting event. It just kind of had a street party. It had a street party vibe to it. But the process now is done. This major hurdle. Of course, there's things going to be discussed in the weeks, the months, even the years to come. The fine details. The diplomacy and the trade negotiations that follow. This will take, and the legislative things. This will take a time to finally sort out. But this major hurdle has been cleared. But where does that leave the European Union fanatics? Where does it leave the globalists? Where does it leave the anywheres? and where does it leave the Fabian left? I think we now know where the traditional working class left are. They are socially conservative, and they've formed this kind of electoral alliance. They've lent the Conservative Party their vote, saying, okay, you get Brexit done, and then we'll just see where you are. But the Fabian progressive middle class left and the globalists and everybody else I've mentioned, where do they go to next? And I think I've got an idea by watching a few of the trends, few events that have happened this week, and I'm starting to get an idea, watching how they're behaving, where they are going to take the fight. And I think it's going to be right at the heart of British culture. I think they're going to attack the history. I think they're going to attack British culture. I think they're going to attack the national identity by going after some totemic things that most of us take for granted, or most of us just accept and have absorbed into our lives. And because it's a very progressive left-wing Marxist thing to do, is to destroy people's identities by picking at the pillars that their identities rest on, and trying to pit them against each other, the divide and rule strategy. So this is what I mean. So this week we've seen a number of things going on. I'm going to touch first of all on the Horrible Histories video that Nish Kumar fronted. So this is what I understand. I mean, the people saying, oh, it's a video from 9 years ago, but Nish Kumar's presentation was very recent, very up to the minute. So what I think, they took some clips from Horrible Histories from various shows, possibly up to 9 or 2009 or whatever it was, and then had the piece by Nish Kumar fronting it to try and decontextualize the material where it originally came from and put it into this different narrative that he's pushing. And right from the word go, I hated the resentful look on his face, that sheer spite that he has towards the audience. Now, when I was at film school, I was taught by two of my tutors were excellent, and both of them said in their different lectures, you must never, as a filmmaker, as a TV producer, and I would extend this to a content creator, never hate your audience. I think that's really important. You can have your own ideas, you can challenge the audience, you can push the audience, but you must never hate them. You are producing something that you want people to engage with and stay with. And if you make something that is filled with hate, it will ultimately fail. So, and that's what I think this is. Kumar's look of hatred towards the viewers, think all these things are British, you're wrong. And he said, yay, go Britain, leaving the European Union. Remember, this was put out on the CBBC channel, so it's really political. It's very blatantly political with one point of view, and it's going out to children. I believe CBBC is for children aged 8, 9 and above. So getting them at a very young age. And it says that nothing that Britain has, hardly anything that Britain has, it developed on its own. It implies that everything we've achieved has been done through military conquest, stealing, enslavement. And this is all a massive distortion of what has happened. It disregards a lot of genuine achievements, on which things like Magna Carta, the 1689 Bill of Rights are two of them. This kind of idea of accountable government. And all the scientific innovations over centuries that Britain has done, and that other countries didn't do first. They had to get it from Britain. Even the EU, the idea that the EU is a democratic institution and governed by the rule of laws. There's a lot of fallacies to that point of view. But where did the EU get this from? Who's the template? Well, the template is the United Kingdom. So the EU have appropriated things, that have massively distorted it, and well, it really is the veneer of a kind of democratic, accountable system. But Kumar doesn't want you to know that. He just wants to put out things like tea actually originated in India. No, it didn't. It originated in China. that's an interesting story in itself, how China completely controlled tea. They had all the tea in the world, and they controlled it, a monopoly, and it wasn't for the benefit of their own people. It was just for the ruling dynasty and the aristocrats, the higher ups, the mandarins. They got the tea. The peasants barely got anything. And by Britain going in, sending in a botanist spy, yes, they did exist, sending in a botanist spy to get tea plants and take to India, grow in India, it opened up the tea trade to the world, but it also provided a bountiful crop for India and modern day Bangladesh that has benefited both economies. So it's all a massive distortion. There's a lot of factual inaccuracies in his video, but I don't want to get too much into this. So that's one attack on the culture, and it's interesting that they were hyping up the thing about tea and sugar, because these are all part of the ritual of British taking high tea or having tea breaks. This is very much part of the centre of British culture and tradition. It's what people around the world know the British for. What's a quirk of the British? Oh, they love taking tea in the middle of the afternoon. So this idea that we sit down to have a pot of tea, share a pot of tea, and we might provide little sandwiches or biscuits, cakes, things like that, and we share them with our relatives, our neighbours, even visitors. You have, in this country, it's traditional. As soon as you have workmen in the place or tradesmen in your house, or you have people to provide a service, they're going to be in your house for a little while, fixing your drains, fixing your electrics and whatever, you offer them tea. It is the thing that helps the social discord, and it cuts across class as well. You may be kind of middle class, you've hired in a tradesman to fix part of your house or to install something. You offer them tea. You have a tea yourself, you offer them tea. It's a great leveler. Obviously the upper classes and rich people can have elaborate teas. The cake's nicer, the sandwiches are nicer. It's all done on multi-tiered cake stands. But the idea that throughout the country, people will be doing this little ritual in their own way, at their own economic levels, but it's something uniting. And along comes Nish Kumar. And it's no surprise, Nish Kumar and the Horrible History team, and said, what can we attack? If you want to attack the British identity, you go after this universal thing. We want to pit the upper classes and the proud traditionalists against the working classes and the social conservatives. What better thing to pick at and to dismantle than the little ritual, the little thing that unites both ends of the class spectrum? And so you have this attack on culture, and expect more things like this. I mean, I expect the call to take down statues, to remove paintings, to remove books and literature. And speaking of literature, the incident with Alistair Stewart, this is where he is on an online spat with what turned out to be a racial politics advocate. And they're having a discussion, and Stewart quotes Shakespeare. This is the Bard, the single most famous writer in English literature, and he quotes it. And because that quote from Measure to Measure contains the word ape, the activist seizes upon his chance. Aha, now I can accuse Stewart of being a racist because he's used the word ape at me. Takes it out of the context. The whole quote is, correct me if I'm wrong, I read Measure for Measure many years ago at school, and I've not seen it performed live, so doesn't seem to do the Globe very often. So I haven't seen it, but if I'm getting this wrong, please answer in the comments below. But it's about the hubris and ignorance of man, and just apes thrown in there. It's not a racial slur. It really is measuring the gulf between God in his wisdom and man in his kind of rage, animalistic rage, unites all of us. It's not meant at a specific racial group. It's meant at humanity itself. Stuart's used this quote at a white person before on Twitter. So he gets removed from his post, and it's interesting that he's one of a number of journalists and newsreaders of a certain generation, men who are now in their 60s and early 70s. So I'm thinking Alistair Stewart, and there was also Peter Sissons, John Humphreys, people like that, and they're becoming very sceptical about the politicisation of news in the United Kingdom. That's not to say that those journalists I've mentioned are particularly right-wing. I mean, they are kind of, soft liberal, I would say, centrist, centre-left, but they also always understood that you couldn't push a political agenda too far if you are to be a credible journalist, particularly one working in television news, particularly the BBC or ITN. You had to suppress your own politics, and sometimes it would leak out here and there. They were never our guys, but they were never pawn to the left either. And what's happened is that I think there's been a move within news producers and news editors and TV networks to remove that generation. It's interesting that they've all got shoved aside at approximately the same time. And now a lot of newsreaders and journalists have been speaking up for Alistair Stewart, but tellingly, no news producer or no news editor has spoken up for him. And I think that this show that that looks like there's an agenda to push out the kind of solid, traditional journalists that would suppress their political leanings in order to pursue a kind of relatively trustworthy journalism and replace it with more activist journalism on our TV screens. So again, it's attacking another pillar of British culture, the BBC. I mean, this is the network that last weekend gave us the bombshell Doctor Who episode that there is an incarnation of the Doctor who is a black woman. So the Doctor Who fans were saying, well, where is this a future Doctor Who? No, apparently it's not a future Doctor Who, it's a past Doctor Who. But where in the past? And the implication is, although it's not been stated clearly yet, we might find out in subsequent episodes, but what has emerging is that this might be from a regeneration cycle that was before what we've always considered to be the first Doctor, William Hartnell. So there was perhaps a whole regeneration cycle of the Doctor that predates the 13 men that were in the middle. This is interesting because it implies that all-white male 13 Doctor incarnation is perhaps an aberration, that the Hartnell Doctor is the start of a wonky life cycle for the Doctor. I wouldn't put it past them, again, taking our trusted institutions, taking things that we have adopted into our culture and attacking them and trying to divide and rule over them. So where is this all heading? Well, one other thing I'd like to mention at this point is something that was brought to my attention earlier on in the week, and this is regarding the shock jock Mike Shepherd on Talk Radio. And he said something, he was extremely dismissive and rude about people who feel that a population replacement is going on in the United Kingdom and to a wider extent Europe as well. So that white, you could say indigenous, but certainly white Britons who probably have a history of a genealogy that goes back generations, centuries even, and they're being replaced by people primarily from the Islamic world. And Graham not just took a contrary point of view on this, he actually took a very aggressively contrary view. So Graham was berating people, calling on his show, and if they weren't quite sharp enough or articulate enough, and let's face it, people who try and phone in the shows, he doesn't want to deal with anybody who is articulate and perhaps knows some stuff and can back it up with facts. He's going to want, much like James O'Brien, he's going to want people that he can easily stomp on in like 60 seconds on a radio show. He's a trained radio disc jockey. His callers aren't. So he doesn't want to have an honest backwards and forwards discussion. He basically wants to be an attack dog, stomp on those that he considers inarticulate and ill-informed. And he comes away looking like a good guy. Now, I've never liked Mike Graham. I think he is a loudmouth. I think he's, rude, obnoxious, loudmouth, dishonest, all these things. He went on a big rant, anti-Count Dankula rant a few years ago. And even though he was proven wrong, he kept doubling down, he was extremely rude and abusive towards people. Anybody that was trying to be rational with him, he got even more rude and abusive. Never liked the guy. I put him in the same category as James O'Brien. Will not listen to reason. I don't know why people think he's our guy. He was never that. He's... if anybody thinks he's on the right, he's there under false pretenses. He said, I tell it like it is. Well, yeah, that's a self-bestowed moniker, and I don't trust them. I don't trust anybody who gives themselves a title. That includes Napoleon Bonaparte. So this is... so to go back to... He's rubbishing the replacement theory. Now, I think there's something worth investigating. There's been evidence cropping up. There's been documents. There's been a lot of evidence, and there's people's lived experiences as well in communities. And I think this all is worth examining and being honest and talking frankly, but not with loudmouth frauds like Mike Graham, whose job it is, and he's a media establishment guy. His job is to poo-poo it, squash it, so that it never becomes a talking point in the first place. These things tend to get framed as racist. It's not racist to defend yourself. It's not racist to say, I feel like I'm being pressured, pushed out. We have so much on diversity. The only thing you can't bring to the diversity table is being white and saying, well, my family's been here so long, I can't even trace my genealogy. It's just, I was here, my parents are from this country, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and beyond that, they've been here for a long time and absorbed all our British culture. Because replacement isn't just about ethnic replacement. I don't think that would be as big a problem, because we've had people coming in from Commonwealth African countries over the years. We've had people come from Sikh countries for goodness me decades now. That wasn't a problem because A, the numbers weren't that massive, but B, Britishness, the British way of life, wasn't being drastically altered by the people coming in. That happened subsequently. That's happened a lot with the Islamic immigration. It is changing, rapidly changing. A combination of Islamic culture coming in from the Middle East and from South Asia, coupled with progressive left and Marxist ideas. They've come together, those two, and they're absolutely picking apart British culture, British traditions, British systems, and to deny this is happening. And it's interesting. Mike Graham said that there's no such thing as indigenous British people, which is wrong. Because so many countries in the world right now, if you take Greece for example, you say, oh, there are no indigenous Greeks. This is technically true because there were the Mycenaean and Minoan Greeks that were around thousands of years ago, and then they kind of collapsed. Pardon me, their civilizations collapsed, and it's still a mystery why the Mycenaeans suddenly collapsed. And then a group of people from the Caucasus called the Dorians moved in, and that's the descendants of the modern Greeks. So everybody's been on the shift, but in Britain, our shift stopped about 1,000 years ago with the Norman conquest. And people say, oh yeah, we're Normans, we're Vikings, we're Danes, we're Saxons, and we're Celts. There's no indigenous people. Well, there were the Celts, and then the Romans came along first, but that was an aristocratic replacement. So the Romans conquered, but they didn't have this massive influx of Romans settling in Britain. It was just kind of people at the top settling here, imposing an army and a government on that. And it was the same with the Normans. That was an aristocratic takeover. The Vikings, Danes, pretty much something similar. It was really only the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes that came over as a kind of population replacement, and they took over the east and south of what was then England. Well, it wasn't really called England until they came, but it's this land that today we call England. So if you draw a diagonal line from about Lincolnshire down to Dorset, everything to the east of that is pretty much Anglo-Saxon. And then it kind of stayed that way. And then we were allowed to develop our culture and our systems with this pretty much stable population. So that's what we generally mean by the indigenous people. And Mike Graham's being really dishonest, and he's just playing the same trick on the audience that Nish Kumar's trying to play. There is no Britishness. You may as well just wipe it all away and replace it with this kind of hybrid, with this progressive left hybrid mixed in with goodness knows what from everywhere else in the world. Just as long as that Britishness gets completely swept aside because we're really embarrassed about who we were in the past because we hate ourselves. This is basically it. And I expect this kind of thing to happen pretty much over the next year or two. You're going to see more attacks on everything we just take for granted, that your parents took for granted, your grandparents took for granted, all the little things. It will be ascribed to being racist or sexist or homophobic or harmful, and it has to be swept aside, and this new cultural imposition has got to be imposed and take its place, and if you're not up with it, you get swept aside as well. And on that cheery note, I'm going to wish you a good week, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.